My name is VIII. I am a visual artist, and usually I work with various media. One of my main themes is to connect discourse, the classical discourse of art and the modern discourse. And during the pandemic in Brazil, I started to work with this very traditional thing, which is a landscape. Landscape in painting, right? In history of art, it was always very present, very well used topic. And one thing that started to appear in the landscape for the last 2 years, it was the masks that the people were using and are using still because of the coronavirus. And I was thinking how to work with this object. You know, it became like trash. It's visible everywhere, all around the world, in all the landscapes. So I started to produce the masks that were covered with clay. I started to make them specifically in the moment when I was reading the news about all the mass graves that were dug around the city of São Paulo during the peak of the pandemic. And it was some sort of activity, a therapeutic activity somehow, you know. Everybody felt endangered, and all the news were horrible every day. And the practice in the studio became some sort of automatic therapy, just to put out the thoughts, put out the stress out. And in my mind, each mask could be some sort of death mask. The pieces that were also done in ancient cultures. So I've been looking at the photos of the mass graves, and I was imagining that, you know, each body is a mask, and I started with this idea of creating a space which would be full of them, full of the very ephemeral masks covered with clay. But then I started to develop this idea, and I thought about creating a piece that would that could be connected with the public space. The masks laying down in the landscape being a public space, and then what could be the best material to work, thinking about the public space. So I thought about the public sculptures, the public monuments that are usually made in bronze. And then I connected these two elements, and I decided to try to produce a sculpture which could be small in scale and also looking fragile, but made in a material that usually depicts very important personas or moments in history, and that are displayed in the public. So that's how that is the story behind the piece. And right now I'm producing the series of the masks, and yeah. My name is VIII. I am a visual artist, and usually I work with various media. One of my main themes is to connect discourse, the classical discourse of art and the modern discourse. And during the pandemic in Brazil, I started to work with this very traditional thing, which is a landscape. Landscape in painting, right? In history of art, it was always very present. It's very well used topic. And one thing that started to appear in the landscape for the last 2 years, it was the masks that the people were using and are using still because of the coronavirus. And I was thinking how to work with this object. You know, it became like trash. It's visible everywhere, all around the world, in all the landscapes. So I started to produce the masks that were covered with clay. I started to make them specifically in the moment when I was reading the news about all the mass graves that were dug around the city of São Paulo during the peak of the pandemic. And it was some sort of activity, a therapeutic activity somehow, you know. Everybody felt endangered, and all the news were horrible every day. And the practice in studio became some sort of automatic therapy, just to put out the thoughts, put out the stress out. And in my mind, each mask could be some sort of death mask. The pieces that were also done in ancient cultures. So I've been looking at the photos of the mass graves, and I was imagining that, you know, each body is a mask, and I started with this idea of creating a space which would be full of them, full of the very ephemeral masks covered with clay. But then I started to develop this idea, and I thought about creating a piece that could be connected with the public space. The masks laying down in the landscape being a public space, and then what could be the best material to work, thinking about the public space. So I thought about the public sculptures, the public monuments that are usually made in bronze. And then I connected these two elements, and I decided to try to produce a sculpture which could be small in scale and also looking fragile, but made in a material that usually depicts very important personas or moments in history, and that are displayed in the public. So that's how that is the story behind the piece. And right now I'm producing the series of the masks, and yeah. My name is Wojtek. I am a visual artist, and usually I work with various media. One of my main themes is to connect discourse, the classical discourse of art and the modern discourse. And during the pandemic in Brazil, I started to work with this very traditional thing, which is a landscape. Landscape in painting, right? In history of art, it was always very present, and very well used topic. And one thing that started to appear in the landscape for the last 2 years, it was the masks that the people were using and are using still because of the coronavirus. And I was thinking how to work with this object. It became like trash. It's visible everywhere, all around the world in all the landscapes. So I started to produce the masks that were covered with clay. I started to make them specifically in the moment when I was reading the news about all the mass graves that were dug around the city of São Paulo during the peak of the pandemic. And it was some sort of activity, a therapeutic activity somehow, everybody felt endangered, and all the news were horrible every day. And the practice in studio became some sort of automatic therapy, just to put out the thoughts, put out the stress out. And in my mind, each mask could be some sort of death mask. The pieces that were also done in ancient cultures. So I've been looking at the photos of the mass graves, and I was imagining that each body is a mask, and I started with this idea of creating a space which would be full of them, full of the very ephemeral masks covered with clay. But then I started to develop this idea, and I thought about creating a piece that could be connected with the public space. The masks laying down in the landscape being a public space, and then what could be the best material to work, thinking about the public space. So I thought about the public sculptures, the public monuments that are usually made in bronze. And then I connected these two elements, and I decided to try to produce a sculpture which could be small in scale and also looking fragile, but made in a material that usually depicts very important personas or moments in history, and that are displayed in the public. So that's how that is the story behind the piece. And right now I'm producing the series of the masks, and yeah.
Olá, boa noite a todos. Como esse painel vai ser conduzido em inglês, eu vou já apertar a tecla SAP. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the closing panel about insurance and climate change. At first, I would like to thank the Brazilian Institute of Insurance Law and its president, Ernesto Zirunik, and also the Superior Court of Justice and Minister Paulo de Tarso Sanseverino for the invitation to moderate this panel on such an interesting and pressing matter. Speaking tonight is Professor Aaron Doyle, who is a very important contributor to IBDS. He has a BA from the University of Victoria, an MA in Criminology from the University of Toronto, and a PhD in Sociology from the University of British Columbia. From 2000 to 2002, he held a postdoctoral fellowship in the School of Criminology at Simon Fraser University, and in 2002, he joined the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Carleton University. Professor Doyle, thank you so much for talking to us tonight, and you can have the floor now.
Thank you very much, Jessica. Hello from Canada, everybody. It's an honor to be part of the Congress again, and thanks to the Brazilian Institute of Insurance Law and Dr. Ernesto for inviting me. As I like to say, the Institute is a great model for other countries. We should have more similar organizations which are independent and not run by the industry to work for the public good. This talk builds on a chapter I wrote with my colleague, Dr. Mathieu Charbonneau, who is currently at the University of Montreal. And so we're talking about the contradictory positions of the insurance industry in the time of climate change. But I'm going to start by presenting a vision of insurance because it underlies the rest of my paper. So insurance is not just another business. Insurance is not just a profit-making machine. Instead, insurance occupies a very special social role. And so I've called this idea insurance exceptionalism. Insurance is an ingenious mechanism of producing mutual help, building a community of support against many of our worst fears and threats. And so insurance has a distinctive place. It's a central social institution. It's one of our key institutions, and I like to say it's like law or medicine or the news media. So lawyers are not just business people. Lawyers are officers of the court with a public duty to the law and justice. Doctors have duties of care to patients that are not just about earning money, and the news is not a business. It's crucial to democracy. So my proposition is that insurance is and should be more than a business. This proposition is aspirational. It's stating an ideal. Perhaps it's a dream. Perhaps it's somewhere that insurance used to be and tries to get back to. But too often in today's complex business world, insurance has moved away from these original idealistic roots, and climate change is becoming the greatest test of this proposition. So insurers have been planning for climate change for many years. Global warming became a public issue in the late 1980s, but long before that, Munich Reinsurance first warned about climate change. So a Munich Re brochure on floods way back in 1973 called attention to, quote, the rising temperature of the Earth's atmosphere, as a result of which glaciers and the polar caps recede, and said its conceivable impact on the long-range risk trend has hardly been examined. So insurers were among the first to know. So Brazil has seen extreme weather events this year, including the floods in Manaus, drought. Right now, as I'm speaking to you, in my home province of British Columbia on the west coast of Canada, where my brother and sister and mother are, there's extreme weather and it's leading to catastrophic flooding. My family is okay, but vital highways and railroads to the city of Vancouver have been destroyed or incapacitated. Some will not reopen for months. It's threatening the food supply. People have died, trapped in their cars. And so just several months earlier, we had a different kind of catastrophe. We had record-breaking 40-degree temperatures and a season of infernal forest fires, fires that were incinerating whole towns, reducing them to ashes in minutes. So we had very different catastrophes just months apart. In Canada, the cost of insurance claims due to extreme weather has increased by 4 times. It's quadrupled over the last 10 years. Canada's Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, said on Wednesday, the impacts of climate change have arrived sooner than expected, and they are devastating. People here feel like we have entered a new and very frightening era in which the long predicted global disaster has already begun to unfold. Tom Baker's paper to the Congress on Tuesday talked about how insurers could find ways to insure just about anything, even in the absence of solid actuarial data, which is something that Richard Erickson and I also argued in our book called Uncertain Business. And I find one of the most scary signs at the moment is that I read a report from the Insurance Institute of Canada. I read it yesterday, that if business as usual continues with climate change, by the end of the century, there will be severe weather damage that will be uninsurable. And that is very frightening to me if it can outrun the insurance industry. So what can insurers do in this time of great challenge? I've been thinking about causes of inaction on climate change, causes of the lack of movement by governments, business, and other actors. And some of these causes are related to what sociologists and economists call problems of collective action. So problems of getting individuals and organizations to work together in the common good, especially problems getting different nations to work together. Some of the causes of inaction are challenges around time and temporality. So problems of getting various actors to respond to challenges with long and uncertain temporal horizons. And some of the causes of inaction are to do with uncertainty and limited risk knowledge. All of these challenges are challenges that insurance is well suited to address. Insurance is fundamentally about the collective working together. Insurance is a global industry that works across national borders. Insurance is about managing risks with uncertain temporality, with very extended time horizons. and insurance is fundamentally about managing threats in conditions of uncertainty. Insurers have various roles in relation to climate change, and I will sketch these roles while discussing how they sometimes exist in tension with one another. And underlining this are tensions about whether insurance retains its original normative core as a mechanism of social solidarity for the collective good. So one key tension, once insurance utilized, is tension between the solidarity of the original collective and a second kind of pool in publicly owned companies, which is the shareholder pool. So there's this opposition between the risk pool and this other collective of the shareholders, which is pitted against the original risk pool through the doctrine of shareholder value. So the conventionally understood role of insurers is as financial protector through paying compensation for losses. The ways this role plays out in particular in insurance context is always negotiated in tandem with the state and state institutions. Okay, so a first point, of course, is that only some problems can be fixed with money. If climate change kills, money cannot help. But beyond that, insurers' protector role may be constrained by the profit motive and pursuing shareholder value, given that unlike the state, private insurers have no formal mandate to protect all citizens. There is, however, an unstated imperative to strive to protect all consumers inherent in the notion of insurance exceptionalism, that insurance is not just another business. So private insurance can operate as a profound mechanism of social solidarity, socializing risk among the insured and in an inclusive risk pool. However, the extent to which private insurance socializes risk in practice varies from pool to pool, depending on decisions of the insurer about who's included and at what premium, especially in the neoliberal era. Private insurance has been marked by the unpooling of risk, segmentation, and inequality among populations. So insurers increase premiums for the more risky, and they may simply exclude the bad risks in certain pools, or insurers may decide to step out of some markets partially or altogether. For example, facing $24 billion in losses due to unprecedented climate change-driven wildfires in California in 2017 and 2018, insurers simply refused to renew tens of thousands of home insurance policies. Insurers dropped so many policies that the California government had to introduce a moratorium on canceling home insurance policies. Many other California homes saw massive premium increases, thus growing numbers of California residents, especially those most at risk, no longer have insurance. So the availability of insurance for those at risk of the effects of climate change is dropping. At the same time, insurers are also portraying climate change as a time of great growth and opportunity for the industry. So the bad risks are being excluded, but it's also a very profitable time. For example, a new report from Swiss Re said climate risks will be a main driver of the growth in property insurance. we estimate that climate risks will grow the global property risk pool by 33 to 41%, generating 149 billion to 183 billion dollars of US dollars of new premiums by 2040. So, situation with flood insurance is similar. Private flood insurance may increasingly be limited to high reward areas where insurance is available to those with the ability to pay rising premiums and leaving the high risks to the state. Climate risk insurance will become too expensive for the poorer segments. Flood insurance regimes are negotiated by insurers and governments, and the availability of flood insurance is very uneven, and it's very different across and within different nations. So in Canada right now, we have these massive floods, but private flood insurance coverage remains very limited. As the Insurance Bureau of Canada reports, flood insurance is likely unaffordable for the 10% of homeowners who need it most, those who are living on floodplains and other high-risk areas. Also, as we're now seeing, many Canadian policyholders assume they're covered by flood insurance when they're not. Also, flood risk is spreading geographically, and many homeowners now, right now, are realizing that they now live in flood-prone areas and may need flood insurance. So, in an ideal world, in an ideal model, this lack of insurance and rising premiums would be a good thing in that it might incentivize or force consumers to relocate to other areas or take other preventive measures. But this ideal world does not exist. So this ideal world is based on a series of faulty assumptions that consumers are rational, often no. That consumers understand their insurance coverage, often no. That consumers have the choice and the resources to move, often no. That there are available measures that could mitigate climate-related risks, often no. So, as Rebecca Elliott notes, as other risks currently privately underwritten intensify under climate change, like wind and wildfire, increasing premiums may mean that more and more people cannot afford to buy their way into increasingly private networks of risk sharing. And these people will fall to the state to handle, and there will be a splintering of protectionism and increasing burdens unequally felt. Now, we know that marginalized people who experience various kinds of inequality, for example, the poor, the racialized, tend to be more impacted by climate change anyway, for many reasons. And so inequalities in the availability of insurance compound these harms of climate change to poor and racialized people. So covering climate risks is, of course, increasingly risky for insurers themselves, even as it has the potential for massive profits. Reinsurance becomes ever more crucial. Climate change-induced catastrophes generate potential risk aggregation or hypercorrelation issues for insurers. Catastrophic risks that, because of their engulfing multidimensional nature, threaten to swamp frontline insurers who may be providing many different lines of insurance to affected regions. And insurance often doesn't work how it's ideally supposed to work. Ideally, insured risks must be independent in space and across different insurance markets to be manageably underwritten in order to avoid insurers being overwhelmed by these causally related waves of claims in different types of insurance. But extreme weather catastrophes, for example, major hurricanes like Hurricane Ida 2 months ago, can trigger massive claims across large geographical areas and across many lines of insurance like life, home, car, business interruption, liability, and so on. Okay, so beyond simply compensating policyholders, a second very important role of insurance and also reinsurance is as a resistor of and mitigator of climate change. So insurers have incentives not simply to cover risks. Insurers can also actively intervene in the risk environment and try to reduce the effects of climate change. So insurance functions in many ways as a form of governance beyond the state, negotiating different risk regimes together with the state. And this is apparent in the governance of climate change risks and risk mitigation. So insurers have various motivations. Insurers have children and grandchildren like the rest of us, and are thinking of, we're all thinking about the futures of those children and grandchildren. And insurers' expert knowledge may make them even more aware of the effects of global heating as the legacy that we're passing on to our children. And I believe many in the industry do have a sense that insurers have a special social responsibility, and insurance is not just a business. Fighting climate change also helps promote positive public perceptions of the industry at a time when the industry faces reputational risks, some of which I will come to shortly. Beyond that, insurance claims operations may be more profitable if climate change related claims are minimized, especially in particular contexts when insurers are constrained in their ability to raise premiums. Okay, so reinsurers in particular have the motivation, resources, expertise, and global reach to play a significant role in fighting climate change. As Turo Kimmo Leitonen notes, reinsurance companies are leading global actors in enlightening governments, investors, and stakeholders about the horrors of climate change. At the same time, the existence of reinsurance paradoxically to some extent creates incentives which may inhibit insurers and others from pursuing loss prevention initiatives more thoroughly. So Richard Erickson and I have talked about what we call moral risk, and moral risk is the tendency by which insurance may sometimes paradoxically encourage risky behavior. So if it's risky behavior by insured parties, we call that moral hazard, but insurance can also encourage risky behavior by insurers. And part of the social duty of insurers as an exceptional social institution is to guard against this. So insurance and reinsurance can have the paradoxical effect of supporting the status quo and limiting risk mitigation effects, both by insurers and others. So the kinds of things that insurers are working, but even so, insurers have often been active in the fight against climate change. For example, the Insurance Bureau of Canada, the Canadian Property and Casualty Insurance Trade Association is working to foster climate resilience. So working with governments in flood risk reduction, climate change adaptation, including 6 steps, educating and empowering consumers to mitigate, improving land use planning, making targeted infrastructure investments, improving building codes, sharing data, preserving and restoring wetlands. So similarly, through its involvement in the Munich Climate Insurance Initiative, the industry works with research institutes and non-governmental organizations and attempts to help adaptation to climate change globally, including in developing countries with little insurance coverage. Insurers also use insurance arrangements to compel insured people to take further preventative measures. For example, in America, coverage subsidized by the National Flood Insurance Program is only offered to communities if they implement measures such as floodplain management and building standards. So insurance can push others to mitigate risks. Insurers can also use rebates on catastrophe bonds to incentivize governments to take preventive measures. However, insurer loss prevention efforts can also sometimes be selective and exclude some people. So for example, with California wildfires, insurers have employed their own private fire crews to try to reduce damage and cut claims. And so the private fire crews travel into fire zones in trucks equipped with water tanks and hoses, just like public firefighters, but they only protect specific insured homes. No insurance, no help from the private firefighters. Okay, so a third role of insurers is that insurers have a very important position on the public and media stage as objective risk experts. So when advocates want to demonstrate that climate change is a reality, advocates will do this by pointing out that the insurance industry treats climate change as real. So climate change is real. It must be real because insurance companies say it's real. Insurers thus have an important symbolic role in the fight. Insurers have a particular kind of institutionalized symbolic capital in the fight against climate change. And as Jessica Weinkohl notes, climate scientists frustrated by a lack of international policy movement on climate change have tried to ally with the insurance industry to help promote recognition of the seriousness of the risks. So with this important symbolic role as climate risk experts, insurers also have a global responsibility. And just as an aside, it's revealing about contemporary modes of truth that scientists must rely on business to claim that their position's objective. It's an interesting shift. But the relationship between the insurance industry and climate science is complex and politicized. Jessica Weinkohl argues the extent to which the insurance industry, I'm quoting from her here, the extent to which the insurance industry directs, funds, and validates the production and use of science for estimating risk is itself a full-blown political enterprise that functions to prioritize industry interests in views of hurricane risk and potentially narrow the broader discussion of disaster losses to the single solution of insurance pricing. The science of hurricane behavior is uncertain and vast enough that science can create modeled risk estimates to suit the needs of insurers, depending on what they wish to accomplish as they compete against one another in the market and interact with regulators. So, complex relationship between insurance and climate science. So, talked about how insurers work to compensate for, mitigate against climate change, and that they have this symbolic role. But another very different type of role, intention with all that, is that insurers are also major facilitators of climate change that they are guarding against. So insurers also help facilitate climate change, even as they guard against it. To give a simple example, auto insurance is a product that indirectly but centrally fuels climate change. But beyond that, the availability of various insurance coverage is also one of the key financial conditions enabling the development of fossil fuel projects, such as oil rigs, oil sands, oil pipeline projects. They depend on insurance. And in our chapter, I talked about how major insurance companies, Chubb and Zurich, had recently increased their coverage of Canada's controversial Trans Mountain oil pipeline. So one environmental activist said, any insurance company that claims to care about the climate cannot insure the Trans Mountain oil pipeline, while it presses ahead with plans to enable a huge expansion of some of the world's dirtiest oil. So I wrote that, we wrote that, and then after our chapter was published at the US Open tennis tournament in September, Chubb Insurance was a co-sponsor, and at the tennis tournament, the activist group Insure Our Future unveiled a 15-foot inflatable balloon doll of the Chubb chief executive officer, along with signs saying, stop insuring dirty fossil fuels. And a week later, Chubb withdrew all its coverage from the oil pipeline. And this is starting to happen. So in the past 3 years, 23 major global insurance companies have adopted policies that end or limit insurance for the coal industry, and 9 insurers have ended or limited insurance for the Canadian oil sands projects. So another way in which insurers facilitate climate change is that they provide liability insurance for corporations, as well as their directors and officers. So the corporations may be sued for contributing to climate change, but they have this liability insurance, which is a source of moral hazard. So massive lawsuits against companies or groups of companies for knowingly contributing to climate change have become increasingly common. As KPMG notes, recent estimates suggest that there have been close to 1,000 climate change related class action suits filed in 25 countries. The American state of Rhode Island, for example, filed a suit that alleges that 21 companies knowingly contributed to climate change and failed to adequately warn citizens about the risks posed by these products. So, and these lawsuits are going to be one way in which governments finance the costs of dealing with climate risks. And there are many unresolved legal questions about whether these lawsuits would be covered by liability insurance. So that's all going to be tested in the courts. Firstly, are these companies liable for climate change, but also there's going to be a legal battle around whether insurers are liable for these costs if the class action lawsuits are successful. And I was just reading a report from Swiss Re claiming that this is going to be a massive exposure for the industry. And the industry journal Canadian Underwriter reports it remains to be seen whether climate liability risk will represent the next asbestos or tobacco liability risk for the insurance industry. Okay, and then a final type of role in tension with the others, or with some of the others, is that insurers are massive investors in oil and other fossil fuels. So they don't only insure fossil fuels, but they invest in them. So the insurance industry controls vast oceans of capital, 20% of the world's capital investments, and from premiums collected, and a massive piece of these investments are in oil and other fossil fuels. So their vast financial holdings mean that private insurers potentially might exert considerable power as shareholders over the governance of those enterprises. They can also withdraw their money. Critics say the insurance industry is slow to divest relative to other institutional investors. Critics also say that oil and fossil fuel investments are becoming increasingly financial risky. To limit climate change, what's going to have to happen is that trillions of dollars in carbon reserves are going to remain unused. And so fossil fuel investments may not have a future. Chubb became the first US insurer to phase out its coal investments by 2022. It will no longer invest in companies that make more than 30% of their revenue from coal mining. In general, insurance companies have been better at divesting from coal than oil. In June of 2021, the American state of Connecticut became the first jurisdiction to legislate that their insurance regulator will have the mandate to push insurers to bring their investments and underwriting in line with science-based emissions reduction targets. So I think we can expect more of this from governments, more regulation of insurers' involvement in oil, coal, fossil fuels. In July of 2021, 8 of the world's largest insurance companies, including Swiss Re, Zurich, and Aviva, committed to transitioning their portfolios to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. 2050 is a long way off, though. So just to sum up and conclude, I've talked about 5 contradictory roles of insurance in relation to climate change. And some of these different roles of insurers are in tension with each other, and they reflect underlying tensions in the institution itself. And insurance is everywhere. It's perhaps not surprising given the size and the complexity of the insurance industry and the ways in which insurance is intertwined with so many aspects of contemporary social life of contemporary societies. It's not surprising that sometimes there are tensions. There are also many tensions and contradictory tendencies in government. Insurers are in a great position to lead the climate change fight because of their ability to work in partnership with the state to provide coverage and mitigation for climate risks because of their specialized knowledge of climate risks and their symbolic position on the public stage as risk experts, and their ability to apply pressure to fossil fuel industries. Insurers have various pressure points, such as limiting coverage of oil and coal fossil fuel projects, limiting liability coverage for climate risks, and divesting from fossil fuels. So there's a lot of potential there. However, there are specific features of the insurance industry that may hinder their climate change, including the fact that insurers' risk management efforts may be constrained by the profit motive and the tension between the broad collective they originally served and the new collective of shareholders they now serve. Insurers are not broadly publicly accountable, unlike governments. In fact, insurers often tend to be invisible, to fade into the background, to be underground. And private insurance is marked by what sociologists would call iatrogenic tendencies, or you can just call the dark side of insurance, that create moral risks, even as insurance guards against other risks. So these tendencies could undermine the insurance industry's potential role in leading the fight, but they do not have to undermine it. Okay, and an interesting unresolved question for me, this is just an aside, but I did not have time to get into in the talk, is around temporality and the relative ability of insurers or governments to deal with risks with a long horizon. That's just an aside, but we urgently all need to do more to fight climate change. You know, I'm feeling it now because my family is in a flood, but you and I, all of us, but also, and especially insurance companies. So insurance companies need to do more urgently. Insurance is not just another business out to make a profit. Insurance occupies a special place at the heart of our societies as a risk manager, as a global risk manager. So insurance can and should be a leader in this fight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Doyle, for such an enlightening lecture. You always give us such an important and unfortunately rare take on the insurance business. So what I would first like to ask is about climate change and climate injustice. Global warming is a deeply unfair phenomenon. In fact, the biggest emitters of CO2 in the world are developed countries, but the countries most vulnerable to global warming are underdeveloped countries, which have contributed the least to it. In your lecture, you said, while insurers work to deal with and mitigate and compensate for the damaging effects of climate change, its work is selective. You have also said that another very different type of role is that the insurance business is also a facilitator of climate change, as insurance coverage is one of the key financial conditions enabling the development of fossil fuel extraction projects, for instance. And insurers also provide liability insurance for directors and officers who may be sued for contributing to climate change. So what I would like to ask is, do you feel that ultimately insurance industry contributes to climate injustice?
Yes, absolutely. So that is absolutely what I'm arguing here. Yes. So thank you for articulating that very well, Jessica. Yeah. So I think I think it's a time at the moment when corporations are becoming more aware of social justice around climate change, but also around issues of race. And I've been very interested in the global reaction to the murder of George Floyd by American police. And for whatever reason, that prompted a flowering of concern by many corporations about issues of social justice. And I'm hoping that that kind of new focus on social justice by corporations is going to also lead to a focus on this kind of global injustice. And yes, I'm absolutely arguing that the insurance industry is a key contributor to climate injustice.
Still on this subject, you talked about the different role insurance plays in different nations. So what I would like to ask is about the different roles insurance should play in developed and underdeveloped countries. Developed countries tend to have a more mature, efficient, and safe industry, usually at the technological frontier. Underdeveloped countries, as a rule, have a less mature industry and have access to less technology. Nonetheless, these countries, underdeveloped countries, usually have access to the same, if not worse, insurance coverage and receive the same treatment, if not worse, when a loss occurs. For instance, when a loss occurs in a mining project in an underdeveloped countries, where little or no money is invested in research and development, where little is known about the topography or the soil, insurers, usually based in a developed country, deny claims based precisely on arguments related to research and science, thus contributing to a vicious cycle of underdevelopment. Do you feel that insurance industry should play any role or an active role in preventing the perpetuation of inequality between the countries from the center and those on the periphery?
Oh, no, absolutely. And again, you've articulated in your question, a particular dynamic that is extremely problematic. And I wish I knew more about what the insurance industry was doing at a more positive, like a positive thing that's happening in developing countries is the facilitation of micro insurance, which has been really good. But the kinds of damage that you are describing, it's you might call it a fulcrum, in that the insurance industry is in this position of a fulcrum that helps the developed world press down on the developing world. Yeah, so.
Okay, so we have one last question from Julia Normandi. In the time of successive climatic phenomena that alters the productivity of the agricultural market, is it possible to use rural insurance as a tool for sustainability policy? Is it feasible to think that insurance might be an important incentive for the creation of technological innovation that pushes insurers to adopt strategies that seek to diminish the risks related to climate change? In the insurance experience, are there any examples of conditional rural insurance policies, as an example, to the observance of environmental preservation guidelines?
Okay, so it's an interesting question with several parts, some of which are too technical for me, but because I don't know very much about rural insurance, but absolutely, it is a time of technical innovation for the insurance industry driven by climate change. Yeah, so. Yeah. Okay. So thanks very much for your questions, Jessica. They were excellent.
Thank you very much, Professor Doyle. I'm going to switch back to Portuguese now to announce the closing words from Ernesto. Thank you very much. E agora a gente vai para algumas palavras finais com o ministro Og Fernandes, o ministro Paulo de Tarso Sanseverino e Ernesto Tsirunik. Boa noite e muito obrigada.
Boa noite a todos. Neste momento em que nós estamos encerrando este magnífico Congresso Internacional de Direito do Seguro, restam apenas palavras de agradecimento a todos que viabilizaram a realização deste magnífico evento, certamente um dos maiores do gênero realizados no mundo este ano. Assim, em nome do Superior Tribunal de Justiça, do Conselho da Justiça Federal, da Escola Nacional de Formação e Aperfeiçoamento de Magistrados, agradeço a todas as pessoas que contribuíram para a sua realização. Começo pelos palestrantes, pelos debatedores, pelos presidentes de mesa. Tivemos representantes de 13 países, inclusive a China, merecendo especial destaque neste ponto a decisiva colaboração da Academia Sino-Lusófona da Universidade de Coimbra, que contribuiu decisivamente para o evento através do professor doutor João Nuno Calvão da Silva, vice-reitor da Universidade de Coimbra. Foram discutidas as mais diversas questões ligadas ao direito do seguro, partindo dos temas tradicionais até temas muito atuais, como o seguro e as mudanças climáticas, que foi objeto da palestra de encerramento que há pouco ouvimos. Agradeço de modo muito especial a todos os ministros do Superior Tribunal de Justiça que participaram deste evento, na pessoa do nosso presidente, o ministro Humberto Martins, que desde o primeiro momento abriu as portas do nosso tribunal para a realização deste congresso. Especial agradecimento também ao Instituto Brasileiro de Direito do Seguro, na pessoa do seu presidente, o professor doutor Ernesto Trunic, que, além de ser uma das maiores autoridades no Brasil e no mundo em direito do seguro, e que foi o grande mentor deste evento, mercê da sua extraordinária rede de contatos em todo o mundo com professores ligados ao direito securitário. Nossos agradecimentos especiais às pessoas que nos bastidores se dedicaram de corpo e alma, não apenas para a realização do evento, mas também para a preservação da sua qualidade, que se mostra ainda mais complexo em um evento dessa envergadura, todo ele realizado em formato digital. Agradecimento à doutora Inaiê Siqueira de Oliveira, à doutora Tayla Tsurunic, do IBDS, à doutora Débora de Melo Moreira, que é a dirigente-chefe do meu gabinete aqui no Superior Tribunal de Justiça, e os integrantes do cerimonial do tribunal, que também tiveram uma participação fundamental para o êxito do evento. Na abertura do Congresso, eu lembrei as palavras do professor norte-americano Grant Gilmore, que em uma obra clássica sobre direito contratual, falava provocativamente sobre a morte do contrato. Agora, eu fiz uma comparação dizendo que hoje já se comenta sobre a morte do contrato de seguro em função de algumas nuances, mas principalmente em função da sua evolução nessa passagem do século XX para o século XXI. Na realidade, o nosso Congresso mostrou ao Brasil e ao mundo que, com certeza, o contrato de seguro não morreu e nem corre o risco de morrer tão cedo. Pelo contrário, apenas a sua regulamentação está sendo renovada pelos chamados ventos da primavera, plagiando o professor Grant Gilmore, e como tivemos oportunidade de conferir ao longo de todas as palestras. Agora, encerrando, apenas um muito obrigado a todos os senhores e até o próximo Congresso Internacional de Direito do Seguro, que deverá ser realizado dentro de 2 anos. Muito obrigado.
Muito bem. Inspirados nos grandes mestres Rui Rosado de Aguiar Júnior, João Calvão da Silva, José Carlos Moitinho de Almeida e Huberto Rutella, assim como nas máscaras que nos protegeram e ajudaram a sobreviver, chegamos ao final do 2º Congresso Internacional de Direito do Seguro e 8º Fórum José Sollero Filho. É enorme a honra de acompanhar, tanto na abertura como agora no encerramento, o ministro Paulo de Tarso Sanseverino, que é, pela 2ª vez, o incansável coordenador acadêmico deste Congresso Internacional de Direito do Seguro. Esta edição foi bem diferente das anteriores, seja do IBDS, seja do Conselho da Justiça Federal e do STJ. Ela foi toda digital e, graças a isto, nós tivemos alguns benefícios. Nós conseguimos reunir muito mais gente, né? Mas tivemos, enfim, a tristeza da distância e gostaríamos muito que os próximos eventos sejam presenciais e a gente possa estar utilizando as duas formas de aproximação, o online com o público e a aproximação presencial, enfim, o convívio com os nossos palestrantes e moderadores. Já está programada, como disse o ministro Paulo de Tarso, a 2ª edição. Isto, se Deus não rir, como disse o professor Tom Baker, né, no início do nosso encontro. E até lá, certamente, vamos estar liberados desse afastamento que nos tem sido imposto nos últimos anos. Bom, isto de realizarmos em 2023, se Deus não rir, caso não tenhamos uma edição especial em 2022, o ano do bicentenário da independência, como provocou o professor João Nuno Calvão da Silva, presidente da Academia Sino-Lusófona da Universidade de Coimbra e seu vice-reitor, na cerimônia de abertura. Nós lamentamos bastante que a professora Ming Zhang e o professor Ayrton Pimentel não tenham podido comparecer como haviam programado, e em razão de questões de saúde que esperamos se resolvam mais prontamente e da melhor forma possível. Tivemos desafios próprios dos tempos de pandemia, que ainda vivemos, mas também tivemos no Congresso muitas alegrias. Embora o mais importante não tenha sido a quantidade de palestrantes, reunimos um grupo extraordinário com mais de 50 painelistas de 13 países, cujas agendas dificilmente seriam conciliáveis não fosse o Congresso online. Durante 4 dias, em 3 sessões, acompanhamos um rico diálogo entre ministros do Superior Tribunal de Justiça, professores, advogados, economistas, engenheiros e líderes setoriais, todos comprometidos com a reflexão séria e crítica de temas centrais do direito do seguro. A todos os painelistas que dedicaram tempo e esforço a este congresso, colocando sua experiência profissional e seu conhecimento a serviço do estudo do direito do seguro no Brasil, renovo o agradecimento de toda a comissão organizadora. O formato online também nos permitiu acompanhar o grande interesse do público. Além dos mais de 500 inscritos na plataforma digital, todos os painéis e palestras puderam e continuam acessíveis no canal do YouTube do Superior Tribunal de Justiça, o Tribunal da Cidadania, que cumpre de modo exemplar a sua vocação de tornar a judicatura e o direito acessíveis para toda a sociedade. Literalmente, mais de 30 horas de debates de altíssimo nível já estão ao alcance de um clique, graças à iniciativa pioneira do STJ, o que agradeço na pessoa de seu presidente, o ministro Humberto Martins, que acolheu com entusiasmo a realização deste encontro e foi um dos grandes promotores da abertura para o público deste congresso. também do nosso coordenador científico, o ministro Paulo de Tarso Vieira Sanseverino, e o ministro Og Fernandes, presidente da Escola Nacional de Formação de Magistrados, assim como o professor Dr. João Nuno Calvão da Silva, vice-reitor da Universidade de Coimbra e presidente da Academia Sino-Lusófona da mesma universidade. Agradecimentos especiais não poderiam deixar de ser feitos novamente aos que tornaram possível organizar cada detalhe para que funcionássemos tão bem, e, entre eles, os 3 líderes que eu volto a mencionar, que foram Inaê Siqueira de Oliveira, a Taíla Tsirunic Cronin e a Débora Moreira, organizando uma quantidade incrível de pessoas maravilhosas que atuaram por detrás das cortinas e que puderam garantir que tudo acontecesse sem absolutamente nenhum acidente. Assim como atuou o cerimonial do Conselho da Justiça Federal. Mas não apenas a eles. Eu gostaria de agradecer também ao fotógrafo Sebastião Salgado, que nos ofereceu obras autografadas para presentear aos homenageados e organizadores, e ao artista plástico Wojtek Kostreva, que desenvolveu uma maravilhosa peça de arte que é bastante simbólica e que foi presenteada a todos aqueles que se incumbiram das palestras, das presidências e das moderações. A lição que emerge dos debates travados por nossos painelistas é que o seguro não é apenas um negócio, ele é um instrumento econômico gigantesco e poderoso e um influenciador de comportamentos individuais e dos estados também. Portanto, é um reitor dos contratos privados e das suas interpretações. O tema é encantador e complexo, mas todos os nossos palestrantes, também confirmaram que o Brasil precisa, com urgência, aprimorar o marco legislativo do contrato de seguro, razão pela qual é inevitável lembrar do projeto de lei de contrato de seguro número 29 de 2017, que aguarda a aprovação do Senado Federal. Os problemas mais aflitivos do direito do seguro são associados à insuficiência do regulamento do Código Civil, que não dedica um artigo sequer a questões de suma importância, como a regulação de sinistro e o resseguro, tornando este funcional para os contratos de seguro. E que trata de um modo bastante impreciso e ultrapassado, envelhecido mesmo, institutos complexos como o agravamento de risco. Eram essas as minhas palavras finais. Até o 3º Congresso Internacional de Direito do Seguro e 9º Fórum José Sollero Filho, em novembro de 2023, se Deus não rir e se antes não acontecer o previsto pelo professor João Nuno, um tempo que esperamos que seja mais feliz e mais próspero, e um tempo no qual já estejamos sob a égide de uma lei brasileira de contrato de seguro, pareados, assim, com os nossos vizinhos da América Latina, com os países europeus, com o Reino Unido, com a China e o tão jovem e simpático Cabo Verde. Muito obrigado a todos. todos eles, todos os nossos palestrantes, também confirmaram que o Brasil precisa, pela qual eles esses mais importantes com os países europeus, com o Reino Unido, com a China e o tão jovem e simpático Cabo Verde. Muito obrigado a todos. Palestrantes também confirmaram que o Brasil precisa, pela qual eles esses mais importantes com os países europeus, com o Reino Unido, com a China